Hello, welcome to a legal mixtape for counselors, information, resources, roles, and case law. My name is Yuki Matsuno, and I first presented this presentation to Moving Forward Family Services on April 21st, 2023. I'm going to go through an agenda first. There'll be a welcome and a land acknowledgement, and also an introduction of myself. And then we'll talk about legal information in contrast to legal advice. I'll introduce you to some legal resources that will hopefully be helpful to you as counselors as well as to your clients. I'm also going to cover some roles for counselors that are available in the family law area as well as one other area, and talk about some of the qualifications that are needed for that. And finally, I'm going to go over an interesting recent case, a decision by the Supreme Court of British Columbia regarding a social worker who was in the capacity of a therapist for a child in a family law matter. I want to first welcome everyone and acknowledge that I am coming to you right now as a settler and as an immigrant from the unceded ancestral and traditional lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations. And I am filled with gratitude for being able to live and play and work and learn on these lands. So thank you. Just a bit more about myself. I'm a Master of Counseling student at City University of Seattle in Vancouver. I'm also an intern counselor finishing up my practicum at Moving Forward Family Services. My day job is as a lawyer. I'm a contractor with a firm that specializes in workplace investigations, mediations, and assessments. And I also have previous experience in family law mediation and child protection mediation. The first matter I'd like to talk about is the difference between legal information and legal resources and legal advice. Legal information and legal resources are usually publicly available. They include general information about the law and specific areas of the law. They could also include information about court processes or legal processes. And as well, legal resources include the statutes or the law themselves. For instance, in the family law area in British Columbia, there is a statute called the Family Law Act, and that outlines the obligations and responsibilities and rights of parents and or members of a relationship when that relationship ends. And that includes in the areas of child support, spousal support, and as well arrangements for the care of the children, and as well property division. So the Family Law Act is a resource too. And this is in contrast to legal advice, which I would say, and there's many definitions about this, but the important parts are that legal advice is specific to the person seeking the advice. It should be given with all the pertinent information about the circumstances of the person, and it is in the form of specific guidance, suggestions, advice for helping the person make decisions in their legal case. Legal advice should be given by a lawyer, and should be given by a lawyer who has been retained by the person seeking the advice or is otherwise hired to represent that person. Say you have determined that what you want to share with your client is not legal advice, but rather is legal information or legal resources. Then the question may arise, nevertheless, is it even appropriate to share it with the client? As with anything else, we as counselors should consider our ethical and legal obligations in our practice as counselors, as well as any standards of conduct, guidelines, or principles of best practice that govern us in our professional associations. And so here are some examples of possible things we could say to a client. Here are some names of family lawyers who may be able to help you. Click Law is an online website where you can get legal information. My sister had the same issue with her ex-husband, and this is what she did. The Law Society of BC has a lawyer directory available to the public where you can look up any lawyer in BC. So I invite you to consider these, and you could also discuss them with peers or supervisors. And you know, it's interesting because there may be different circumstances, of course, where some of these may be appropriate and other circumstances where they may not, especially with respect to number 1 and number 3. The other things to consider, of course, is like boundaries within the counseling relationship and disclosure as well. Now, for number 2 and number 4, about Click Law and about the Law Society Lawyer Directory, those are more publicly available information, and we'll be talking a little bit more about them. But those seem to be information that is available to everyone and accessible. So that's the other point that I'll make here. So I'd like to talk about some legal resources that I find to be really helpful. The Law Society of British Columbia has an excellent list of legal resources for the public, and here's the link. And there's a wide variety of resources, some of which I'm going to cover in subsequent slides. But as a go-to for the first pass at an issue, I would definitely recommend going here. So when it comes to questions about legal issues, there are definitely some common legal resource or legal information questions that you may receive, and you may have yourself, and I've had them too. So the first one is, where can I get a legal information in my language, or a lawyer who speaks my language? Where can I get information about a particular area of law? Where can I get a good lawyer? I can't afford a lawyer, but I need legal advice. I don't want to go to court. What are my other options? So on the first one, where can I get legal information in my language, or a lawyer who speaks my language? There is actually a very interesting resource which I came across in putting together this slideshow, and it's a multilingual legal glossary. And while I can't guarantee that, and I think it says on the glossary that they don't make any representations or guarantees about the accuracy of it, it can be pretty helpful. And there are several languages that are included in this glossary. There's also the Justice Education Society, or JES, Multilingual Help Services, and they have contact information, I think phone numbers and or emails, where you can contact someone who can help convey legal information in several languages. So that might be a really good resource. Another one in terms of finding a lawyer who speaks your language is the Canadian Bar Association BC Legal Directory, and they actually have a search term in the directory where you can look up someone's language. So for instance, I'm of Japanese descent, and so I have people asking me, oh, is there a lawyer who, speaks Japanese or can work in Japanese? I personally can't work in Japanese, but though I speak it, but this legal directory came up with, several lawyers who speak that language. So that could be really handy. And then the other thing I would say is just go into a network or community or service providers who use the language to find out if there are lawyers who speak the language. So the next question, where can I get information about a particular area of law? So Click Law, which is run by the Courthouse Libraries of BC, it's a nonprofit society that runs all the courthouse libraries. They have excellent legal information under specific areas of the law, and they're available online. And the other one is, I'll just skip a bit, but there's Dial-A-Law, which actually has telephone scripts of legal information, and that could be convenient for folks who don't necessarily like computers, but like to hear it, hear the information. And then there's the People's Law School, which is really awesome, also a nonprofit. Their main goal is legal education. They put on seminars, which are now Zoom seminars, and all sorts of topics, from writing your will to rights of employees, all sorts of things. So I would definitely recommend People's Law School. And then if you're looking in particular for family law resources, the Legal Aid BC has extensive resources in family law, including, for instance, directions on how you can file your own desk order divorce, and which means that not using a lawyer, and just the people who are separating or divorcing be able to fill out the forms and file it themselves. So there's all sorts of great information there. Okay, the next question is, where can I find a good lawyer? And the Law Society of BC is the society that looks over, regulates lawyers in British Columbia. It also regulates the public interest, and so that is one source where there's a list of every single lawyer practicing in BC is in the Law Society of BC directory. So that's a good place to start. You can also look up the legal directory under the Canadian Bar Association of BC. Not all lawyers belong to the Canadian Bar Association. Maybe about half the lawyers in BC do, but their legal directory has better search terms. The Law Society just gives the basic information, but you can search different criteria under the CBA legal directory. And then there's also something called the Lawyer Referral Service, and they have a program where you can get some free or very low cost legal advice to begin with, and then you can hire the lawyer if you are interested in doing so. So that's another source of finding a lawyer. Now, lawyers are pretty expensive to hire, and so that is one thing that we get quite often is, I can't afford a lawyer, but I need legal advice. And so there's some resources in BC for legal advice. Legal Aid, Rise Women's Legal Center, which is pretty cool, and it's run by West Coast Leaf and Peter Allard School of Law at UBC. There's also Access Pro Bono, and then UBC, UVic, and Thompson Rivers University Community Clinics. And those are run by and staffed by law students under the supervision of lawyers. So that's another good resource. Okay, and the last one is, I don't want to go to court. What are my other options? One option is mediation, and Mediate BC is a good place to start for explanations of mediation, and then sort of trying to find a mediator. Family justice centers are for folks who are involved in the family realm, and they are staffed by government employees who can do mediation. Also, Access Pro Bono has free family law mediation, and you can call or email there. Okay. So next we're going to go to a completely different topic, and this is why it's called a legal mixtape. I want to talk about some roles for counselors in the legal field and the dispute resolution field, which you may already be aware of, but which are very interesting and different from usual practicing as a counselor in private practice or at an agency. So one role is a mediator, and mediators can be in family law, civil, or child protection, and Mediate BC has rosters in all three areas, and so that's again one good place to look to start with. There are particular qualifications for mediators who mediate in family and child protection. So it would be good to go to that link that I've given you, that the government of BC has some information on that. Another job or role is as a divorce coach, and that is within the context of a field of family law called collaborative law, and that's where the lawyers and the clients sign an agreement that they're not going to go to court, that they're going to resolve it through negotiation and mediation and facilitation. And so in that process, often there's someone called a divorce coach who is attached to each person, each party in a family law dispute. And so those divorce coaches are very often counselors. And so I've given you the BC Collaborative Society website to take a look at the qualifications or training for that. Okay, the next role I'd like to talk about is a parenting coordinator. And a parenting coordinator is a professional who has certain qualifications, and I've given you the link there. And what they do is they help disputing parents who are in a co-parenting relationship to make decisions about their children. And so a parenting coordinator, first of all, tries to help them through mediation or facilitation or negotiation, and tries to help the parents make that decision themselves, and where they cannot, then the parenting coordinator will make the decision for them. And so this is for very high conflict parents usually. And I know I know some parenting coordinators, and they it's a very difficult job, but a very rewarding one, and very interesting. So that's another role that you can look into. And then the next one is family justice counselor, and they are counselors. Well, they're called counselors. You don't need to be like a qualified counselor to be in that role, but certainly that would give you a good leg up. They're basically give legal information and also mediate between parties who seek their help, and they are government jobs. Full-time government jobs. Usually they work in family justice centers, and they basically help folks who are experiencing a family law dispute. So another interesting role to look into. Okay, now the last, I have two more for the family law realm, and um, the first is the Section 211 report writer. And so what happens is sometimes a judge in a family law case may decide that they need a report from an impartial uh, third party who's qualified, who can make sort of observations and recommendations around parenting arrangements, for instance, and the needs of the child for the parenting arrangements. And again, this is often where there is, always, I guess, where there's a lack of agreement between the parents on how they're going to parent the child or children um, after the separation. Um, so Section 211 report writer, there's certain qualifications, and that would be another role that counselors can look into. And the last one with respect to family law I'm going to talk about is the child interviewer, or here the child report writer. This is where either one or both of the parents, or maybe the court, want to hear the views of the child or children in the dispute about parenting arrangements going forward, and how, where they want to live, and all where they're coming from, their viewpoint. So the child interviewer who is writing here the child report does not evaluate or assess. What they do is they take the child's views down verbatim and then write a report directly reflecting those views. So a bit of a no assessment, so different from 211 reports. And they have a roster that you could go to get the training, and then you can get on the roster, and so that is a little bit more of an accessible job, I think, for counselors than Section 211. Okay. Now the last one, last role I wanted to talk about is GLADU report writer, and this is this role would be helping folks who are in facing criminal charges, and they have an Indigenous background, and as a part of the process, I believe it's in sentencing, but I could be wrong about that. But part of the process is to write what's called a GLADU report, and give the background of the person, both in terms of that person's personal background, and then the family context, and then in the context of the larger historical and colonial forces that have shaped that the person, the Indigenous person, and to give that full context to be considered by the judge when sentencing. So there's a bit of information in that link I gave you, but certainly it's a job that probably, like, I know they need lots of people to do this work because there's so much call for it. I'm not sure about the thoughts around the background of the report writer. Certainly they would need to be very, very familiar with Indigenous, history of Indigenous relations and colonization and residential schools, etc. In Canada, but certainly something to look into. Okay, I'm approaching the last part of my presentation, and I want to talk about a recent case that is of interest to our practice as counselors. And you'll see the site there, MSR and DMR, and it was the 2022 BC Supreme Court decision, And I've given you the link there, and you can go straight to the decision. And the main issue in this family law case was whether the father had alienated the child, JS, from the mother, or whether the child was realistically estranged from the mother. So there's an idea, you may have heard of it in family law, called parental alienation. And the idea is that one parent of a divorcing or separating couple alienates the child from the other parent, and that is uses influence, undue influence, and all sorts of techniques to try to destroy the relationship between the child and the other parent. And so, so that was the topic or the issue here. And what is of interest to us is that there is a social worker in this case who was acting as a therapist, as a family therapist, or as a therapist for the child when he was diagnosed with avoidant or restrictive food intake disorder around the time of the marriage breakdown. And the summary of the case, or the case itself, shows that the social worker and the father exchanged approximately 300 emails, and in which the father criticized the mother to the social worker, and the social worker appeared to agree with the father as well. There was nowhere near this volume of communication with the mother, and so it was very one-sided. And the social worker was found to have given legal suggestions to the father, in particular that he should change the parenting arrangements that were in place and request a Section 211 report. And so the Section 211 report by a psychologist recommended, as part of the report, that that the social worker actually be removed as the therapist. Other problems or other parts of the practice of the social worker that were outlined in this case was that the mother had asked to attend appointments and with the social worker, so she could be updated as to the progress of the child, and the social worker refused to make appointments with the mother and did not provide any ways to update the mother about progress. At one point, the mother asked the social worker to withdraw as the therapist, and that was refused. The social worker refused. And what ended up happening, actually, was that the social worker obtained consent or to remain as the therapist for the child directly from the child through the Infants Act. And of course, further, the social worker was involved in the litigation and provided affidavits to support the father. And in fact, the social worker had a lawyer represent her in the litigation, and because she was facing conduct investigation by the College of Social Workers. And the social worker agreed in hindsight that she overstepped her role, and that it was not improper to offer an opinion on parenting time and custody arrangements. And the judge found that the social worker, and in her capacity as a therapist, displayed a significant lack of objectivity, which has unfortunately impaired her ability to provide appropriate treatment to the child and to provide reliable evidence. And the judge found that the strength of the bond between the social worker as therapist and the child was unhealthy and detrimental to the child, and went beyond the ordinary patient care and provider relationship. For instance, the child texted the therapist or social worker whenever he was anxious, and the therapist saw herself as an advocate. And so at the end of the day, the mother's application to remove the social worker as the therapist for the child was granted. So, of course, I want to say that, you know, this is a very specific case. These cases are extremely rare, and of course, this is a specific social worker who was acting as a therapist. Obviously, not a slight to social workers or counselors generally, but it does show and illustrate some of the issues around boundaries and confidentiality and other ethical issues that arise in the the patient counselor relationship, and you know, makes for interesting questions as to ethical conduct and standards of conduct. So that is that case. Please feel free to go through all the links in this presentation and look for yourself. I've also got my email there, and if you have any questions, please just feel free to throw me a question if you like, and if I can answer it, I'll answer it, and if I can't, I'll refer you to someone else. And thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it, and best wishes for your counseling career.